The autumn of 1944 was meant to be the season of triumph for the Allied forces in Western Europe. Following the stunning breakout from Normandy and the swift liberation of France, the strategic euphoria was palpable. The war was widely believed to be over by Christmas. Yet, as the Allied armored columns raced eastward, their advance, which had been so swift and relentless, began to grind to a desperate, mud-caked halt against an unforgiving landscape and a determined, reorganized German defense. The focus of the war shifted away from the glorious battles of maneuver and into a grim, attritional struggle for a single, vital necessity: logistics. The key to sustaining the massive Allied army, now fighting hundreds of miles from the original Normandy beachheads, was a major, functioning deep-water port, and that necessity drew the entire conflict into the flat, unforgiving, waterlogged lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands. This theater, often forgotten in the shadow of the later Battle of the Bulge, became the stage for a brutal, agonizing campaign fought for access to the sea, the Battle of the Scheldt. The central artery of this logistical imperative was the port of Antwerp. Captured largely intact by the British 11th Armored Division in early September, Antwerp was the prize that promised salvation, a massive, industrialized port facility capable of handling the colossal tonnage of supplies required to push into Germany. However, possessing the port was one thing, using it was another. The city of Antwerp lay over 50 miles inland from the sea, accessed only via the long, twisting, and treacherous estuary of the river Scheldt. The entire Scheldt estuary, its approaches, its islands, and its banks, was still firmly in the hands of the German forces, who had transformed the waterlogged polders and marshes into an impregnable, layered defensive fortress. The Germans understood the strategic reality. So long as they held the Scheldt, Antwerp was merely a useless geographic marker. The entire Allied advance was functionally stalled, starved of ammunition and fuel, while the crucial logistical heart of Europe lay tantalizingly close but utterly inaccessible. This brutal, muddy arena of fighting, where the distinction between land and water was often erased, became the fate of thousands of Allied soldiers, primarily from the Canadian First Army, supplemented by British, Polish, and Dutch forces. They were tasked with the unenviable job of clearing the estuary, fighting an enemy entrenched in flooded fields and behind massive sea dikes, engaging in a type of warfare utterly foreign to the open-field battles of France. The campaign was defined by deliberate, slow, frontal assaults against prepared positions, a grinding war of attrition in an environment tailor-made for defense. The landscape was a lethal maze of flooded fields, inundaties, which restricted movement to narrow roads and dikes, channeling the attacking infantry directly into the pre-sighted killing zones of German machine gunners and mortars. It was here, in the cold, wet misery of the Scheldt, that the campaign consumed the lives and emotional reserves of the soldiers, a reality starkly mirrored in the final correspondence of those who fought and perished in the mud. The intense strategic necessity of the Scheldt campaign found its emotional counterpoint in the personal despair of the soldiers committed to the fight. Their misery was rooted not only in the relentless enemy fire, but in the inhumanity of the environment. Unlike the clean rupture of a battlefield wound, the conditions in the Scheldt were a continuous, systemic attack on the physical and psychological well-being of the infantry. Men fought and slept in flooded trenches and waterlogged ditches, their uniforms perpetually soaked, their skin rotting with immersion foot, and their morale sinking into the same bottomless mud that clung to their boots. The anonymous soldier whose final words serve as our anchor, a young man we shall call Private William Will Davies, a machine gunner in the Canadian Black Watch Regiment, penned his last letter from a position deep within the flooded Bevelin Peninsula. His words are not about the grand strategy of the port. They are about the micro-reality of suffering, a raw, desperate communication that cuts through the fog of war and speaks directly to the soul of the conflict. He writes to his mother not of glory or victory, but of the cold that has penetrated his bones, the ceaseless downpour, and the profound, isolating realization that the land itself is actively trying to kill him. This is the perspective of the infantryman trapped in a war of necessity, where survival becomes an act of personal defiance against both man and nature. Will Davies's letter details the brutal tactics required to gain ground in the flooded polders. The advance was reduced to agonizing, short rushes along the tops of the narrow dikes, leaving the Canadian infantry silhouetted against the gray sky. Perfect exposed targets for the German defenders zeroed in across the flat expanse. Every inch of ground was contested with artillery, mortars, and concentrated fire from positions that had been prepared and fortified over months. The landscape, drained for centuries to create fertile farmland, had been deliberately returned to its primordial swamp state by the German engineers, who had blown the massive sea walls. This calculated use of inundation, flooding the land, was a brilliant defensive stroke, designed to maximize Allied casualties and force the attacking troops into a linear, predictable, and ultimately suicidal form of warfare. The emotional burden in Will Davies' letter centers on the immense claustrophobic fear of the water. He describes comrades who slipped off the dike into the freezing water and were swallowed by the mire, their fate sealed not by a bullet, but by the weight of their own waterlogged gear. The water became a character in the narrative of the campaign, an omnipresent, silent, and deadly executioner. The letter is a plea for understanding, an attempt to bridge the immense emotional and physical distance between the cold, wet hell of the Scheldt and the warm, distant safety of home. It captures the essence of the soldier's isolation, the realization that no one back home could possibly comprehend the agonizing misery of fighting a war where the enemy was as much the environment as the man behind the machine gun. His final, poignant words were a raw expression of love and the haunting doubt that he would ever escape the grip of the mud. The tactical genius of the German defense of the Scheldt estuary must be acknowledged as a brilliant, if brutal, utilization of both natural terrain and engineered destruction. The commander responsible for this defensive concept, General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, understood that his mission was not to win the war, but to delay the inevitable by preventing the Allies from utilizing the port of Antwerp. His forces, composed largely of the veteran German 15th Army who had retreated from the Pas de Calais, were initially demoralized but quickly reorganized and reinforced by the sheer advantage of their chosen defensive ground. The German defense was built upon a three-pronged strategic barrier designed to bleed the Allied forces white while holding the crucial estuary, the Breskens Pocket, the South Beveland Peninsula, and Walcheren Island. The defense was layered, requiring the Canadians to fight three distinct and agonizing battles, each presenting unique and lethal challenges. The most immediate threat was the Breskens Pocket, the fortified stretch of land on the southern bank of the estuary. Here, the Germans were entrenched behind massive fortifications, using the dikes and seawalls as natural elevated breastworks. The Canadian infantry was forced to cross treacherous stretches of open ground, constantly under the relentless fire of German 88mm guns, which were deployed not just against armor, but against infantry formations with devastating effect. The German use of minefields and booby traps was particularly ruthless and effective in the Scheldt. The soggy ground made mine clearing a slow, perilous endeavor, constantly delaying the Allied advance and inflicting massive casualties on the engineer and pioneer units. The German policy of deliberate flooding, the Inundaties, was strategically brilliant. By turning the former farmlands into shallow, freezing lakes, they denied the Allies the use of their overwhelming armored superiority, forcing the engagement onto the dikes, narrow, high-risk pathways that favored the entrenched infantry defender. The entire landscape was weaponized, requiring the Canadian forces to essentially engage in amphibious warfare without the necessary specialized landing craft or armored support. The tenacity of the German 15th Army was rooted in their understanding of the strategic stakes. They knew that holding the Scheldt bought precious time for the fatherland, allowing the construction of the Siegfried Line and the mobilization of reserves for the later Battle of the Bulge. Their defense was not a retreat. It was a disciplined, ordered, and often fanatical commitment to a delaying action. They fought with a professionalism that belied the strategic weakness of their collapsing regime. For the Canadian infantry, the Scheldt was a continuous, agonizing lesson in the difficulty of overcoming a brilliant, well-executed defensive concept. Every meter of progress was paid for by a desperate, bloody frontal assault, emphasizing that the war was far from over, and the final battles would be fought not on sweeping plains, but in the cold, wet, unforgiving trenches of a war of necessity. The final and most formidable obstacle in the Scheldt campaign was Walcheren Island. This island, strategically positioned at the mouth of the estuary, was the key that locked the port of Antwerp. Its capture was not merely a military objective. It was a necessity that demanded a radical, high-risk operational plan, ultimately involving the use of the immense destructive power of the sea itself. Walcheren was transformed by the Germans into a literal island fortress, the strongest section of the entire coastal defense known as the Atlantic Wall. The German defenses on Walcheren were a terrifying synthesis of engineering and firepower. The island was ringed with massive reinforced concrete casemates housing heavy-caliber artillery, including long-range 203-meter guns, that commanded the entire estuary. These formidable batteries were designed to blast any Allied ships attempting to enter the river out of the water. The only land access to Walcheren was the narrow, mile-long causeway connecting the island to the South Beveland Peninsula, a single, highly fortified choke point that the Germans had turned into an impenetrable killing zone. Any direct frontal assault across the causeway was deemed suicidal, an assessment tragically confirmed by the heavy casualties sustained by the Canadian Black Watch during their initial attempt to breach the position. Faced with this seemingly unassailable fortress, the Allied command, led by General Guy Simonds of the Canadian II Corps, devised an audacious, desperate plan that involved turning the sea against the land. The strategy was simple: destroy the massive sea dikes that protected Walcheren from the sea, allowing the high tides of the North Sea to flood the entire interior of the island. This massive engineered flood would serve two crucial purposes. First, it would drown the German defensive positions in the interior, forcing the defenders onto the high ground and the coastal batteries. Second, it would allow the Allies to launch a surprise amphibious assault directly onto the coastal defenses, bypassing the deadly causeway. The execution of this high-risk plan was brutal and controversial. Allied heavy bombers, including the Lancasters of RAF Bomber Command, pounded the main sea dikes at Veer, Flushing, and West Capella, shattering the ancient structures and unleashing the full destructive force of the North Sea. The sea instantly poured into the low-lying interior of Walcheren, creating a vast, churning lake that drowned villages, roads, and, indeed, many of the German defensive positions. The calculated use of this environmental weapon was a necessary evil, costing civilian lives, but achieving the essential military objective of neutralizing the island's interior. The final assault on Walcheren, codenamed Operation Infatuate, was a textbook amphibious landing executed by British and Dutch commando units. They assaulted the coastal batteries, fighting fierce close-quarters battles against the disoriented German defenders who had been driven to the high ground. The final capture of Walcheren Island, secured through the deliberate destruction of the landscape, was the last, most difficult piece of the Scheldt puzzle. Its fall finally cleared the estuary, marking the end of the brutal campaign and opening the path to the essential prize, the port of Antwerp. The entire campaign was a grinding, agonizing lesson in the immense cost required to defeat a brilliant, entrenched defense in a hostile environment. The relentless, grinding brutality of the Scheldt campaign, culminating in the destruction of Walcheren, offers the full, tragic context for the final letter of Private William Davies. He did not die in a quick, heroic charge. He died in a protracted war of attrition against mud, water, and machine guns, a fate common to thousands of men who fought for the necessity of logistics. His final communication serves as the emotional ledger for the entire campaign, accounting for the unseen, unquantifiable costs that never appear in the official military communiques. The profound exhaustion and isolation that permeates Will Davies's letter is a direct consequence of the operational tempo and casualty rates in the Scheldt. The Canadian forces, though highly professional, were pushed to their limits by the constant, continuous assaults required to clear the numerous defensive positions. The rate of advance was agonizingly slow, and the cumulative psychological toll of fighting in the cold, wet, and often submerged conditions was immense. Every assault was a frontal attack against a prepared position, guaranteeing high casualties and ensuring that the surviving soldiers were immediately thrown back into the next desperate fight, compounding their fatigue and psychological trauma. Davies's focus on the environment, the burning cold, the never-drying clothes, the constant threat of immersion, reveals the core challenge of the campaign: the systematic erosion of human dignity and endurance by the conditions. The misery was not incidental. It was a deliberate feature of the German defense, designed to break the attacking force not just with bullets, but with disease, hypothermia, and despair. The soldier was constantly fighting two enemies: the German 15th Army and the unforgiving North Sea climate. His letter, written with the heavy, resigned acceptance of his probable fate, is the voice of a soldier whose body and mind had reached the breaking point, a final plea for his human spirit to be recognized before the anonymity of the water and mud swallowed him whole. The strategic irony that defines Davies's sacrifice is that he died for the seemingly unheroic technical objective of clearing a supply channel. He was fighting not for a glorious city or a famous hill, but for the depth of water and the accessibility of a port's docks. This technical necessity, the logistical tale, was the most vital strategic objective in late 1944, yet it offered little of the emotional glory that sustained troops in other theaters. His final letter bridges this gap, transforming the sterile necessity of the port of Antwerp into a personal, tragic sacrifice. He died to keep the logistical heart of the Allied army beating, a sacrifice that, though strategically critical, carried a profound, unseen personal cost. The final goodbye is the ultimate, quiet demand for remembrance, a human anchor in a brutal campaign dominated by engineering, tide charts, and the cold, hard logic of supply and demand. The clearance of Walcheren Island marked the end of the fighting, but it was only the beginning of the immense, unprecedented effort required to make the port of Antwerp fully operational. The final victory was not won by the infantry, but by the colossal, determined efforts of the Allied engineers and clearance divers. The port of Antwerp, while captured structurally intact, was unusable. The Scheldt estuary itself was a death trap, sown with hundreds of German mines, acoustic, magnetic, and pressure-fused, designed to destroy any vessel attempting to utilize the crucial channel. The final critical phase of the Scheldt campaign transitioned from a military battle into a grueling, high-risk war of technical ingenuity and sheer human labor against the relentless ticking clock of the stalled Allied offensive. The task of clearing the 50-mile-long estuary fell to the highly specialized Royal Navy minesweeping flotillas and the clearance divers. This was a mission of relentless, painstaking precision, often performed in freezing, dangerous currents, constantly under the threat of the incredibly sensitive German mines. The German engineers, knowing the strategic importance of the port, had utilized every available technology to ensure that the channel remained closed indefinitely. The mines were complex, designed to defeat standard magnetic sweeping gear, requiring the Allied teams to use a combination of acoustic noisemakers, powerful magnetic coils, and the terrifying hands-on work of the human diver to manually disarm or detonate the weapons. Every foot of the channel was surveyed, every magnetic signature investigated, and every potential explosive device neutralized. The effort was not confined to the water. The port facilities in Antwerp itself were still littered with unexploded ordnance, booby traps, and the wreckage of sunken vessels designed to block the docks. Allied demolition and salvage teams worked around the clock, often under immense time pressure, and the continuous low-level risk of German V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets, which the German command began indiscriminately launching toward the vital port city once they realized its importance to the Allied war effort. The destruction of the Scheldt's seawalls, a necessary tactic for Walcheren's capture, added another layer of complexity. The engineers were immediately tasked with repairing the massive breaches to prevent the total long-term ruin of the surrounding lowlands. The entire effort became a race against time, a direct logistical confrontation between the Allied need for supplies and the German capacity for engineered destruction. Finally, on November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui, sailed triumphantly up the Scheldt estuary and docked at the port of Antwerp. The event was a silent, profound victory. It marked the moment the Allied supply line was finally solved, effectively breaking the logistical bottleneck that had threatened to stall the war in the West. The opening of Antwerp was the true strategic climax of the Scheldt campaign, a triumph of engineering, courage, and relentless logistical determination. The immense sacrifice of the infantry in the polders and on Walcheren had finally been converted into the necessary material reality that would fuel the final push into Germany. The opening of the port of Antwerp fundamentally and irreversibly altered the strategic balance of the Western Front. It was the crucial logistical pivot that allowed the Allies to transition from a state of supply scarcity and attrition into the full, unstoppable offensive capacity that would define the final months of the war. The immense tonnage of materiel pouring through the port, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and winter equipment, was the necessary precondition for every subsequent major Allied military operation, including the defense against the Battle of the Bulge and the final assault across the Rhine. The immediate impact was the resolution of the fuel crisis. The Allied armored divisions, which had been forced into frustrating halts due to the extreme length and inefficiency of the supply lines stretching back to Normandy, could now be rapidly resupplied. The flow of gasoline and diesel, essential for the massive motorized armies, was revitalized, restoring the mobility that the Allied forces needed to leverage their numerical superiority. The availability of high volumes of ammunition was equally critical, allowing the Allied artillery, the king of battle, to engage in continuous heavy preparatory bombardments, saving the lives of the infantry by systematically destroying the entrenched German defensive positions. Antwerp's strategic payoff was demonstrated during the Battle of the Bulge itself, which erupted less than 3 weeks after the port became fully operational. The fact that the Allies could rapidly pivot, committing massive armored reserves like Patton's Third Army to the counterattack, was a direct consequence of the logistical depth provided by the port. Without the immense stockpile of fuel and supplies being unloaded daily at Antwerp's docks, the Allied counteroffensive would have been significantly delayed, allowing the German thrust to penetrate much deeper and potentially achieve its strategic goal of reaching the coast. Antwerp served as the vital, beating heart of the defense, absorbing and processing the raw material of war necessary for the massive counteroffensive. The long-term impact was the establishment of the Allied logistical machine as an overwhelming, unassailable force. The sheer capacity of Antwerp, capable of handling up to 40,000 tons of cargo per day, transformed the Allied ability to sustain a massive continental army. This logistical superiority became the ultimate final strategic weapon against the collapsing German regime. While the German army continued to fight with tactical skill and localized defiance, they were fighting an enemy whose supply chain was now functionally infinite, fueled by the relentless output of the American industrial machine. The soldiers who fought and died for the Scheldt, like Private Will Davies, were, in a historical sense, the logistical infantry, the men who paid the ultimate price to clear the path for the supplies that would guarantee the eventual victory. Their sacrifice, fought in the anonymity of the mud and the mire, was the necessary human cost for the strategic breakthrough that ultimately ensured the rapid collapse of the German Western Front in the spring of 1945. Antwerp was not just a city. It was the symbol of Allied strategic dominance, a prize bought by the immense cost paid by the Canadian, British, and Polish forces in the waterlogged fields of the Scheldt. The Battle of the Scheldt is widely recognized as one of the most difficult and costly campaigns fought by the Canadian Army during the Second World War, a period of unrelenting attrition that inflicted immense casualties on a force that was often fighting outnumbered and always fighting against the most difficult terrain. The raw numbers themselves tell a sobering story. The Canadian First Army suffered over 6,300 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, during the 5 weeks of fighting, a rate of loss that shattered many regiments and underscored the grim, grinding nature of the struggle for the port. The reasons for this high casualty rate were deeply embedded in the strategic necessity and the tactical environment. The Allies had no time for brilliant flanking maneuvers. The logistical crisis demanded a quick, brutal solution, forcing the Canadian command into a series of frontal assaults against the prepared, fortified German positions. The sheer, deliberate difficulty of the terrain, the inundated polders, the narrow dikes, and the heavily mined beaches ensured that every attack was channeled directly into the German killing zones. The defense was layered and deep, meaning that even when one position was taken, the attacking forces immediately faced another, equally lethal strongpoint. The high proportion of casualties suffered by the infantry was particularly devastating. In the waterlogged environment, the advantage of Allied armor and mobile artillery was often negated, forcing the infantry to bear the brunt of the close quarters fighting against the entrenched German machine gunners and snipers. The relentless cold and wet conditions compounded the misery, leading to high rates of non-combat casualties from diseases like immersion foot and hypothermia, which often required prolonged hospitalization and removed veteran fighters from the front. The Canadian soldier in the Scheldt was enduring a constant low-level assault on his physical and psychological being, a continuous battle against the environment that added an unseen toll to the official casualty lists. The fighting itself was marked by the intense, localized resistance of the German 15th Army. These soldiers, though retreating, were fighting with the desperate knowledge that their resistance bought time for the fatherland. Their tactical skill in utilizing the terrain, the mastery of camouflage, the precise placement of anti-tank weapons, and the ruthless use of inundation forced the Canadian forces to engage in a slow, agonizing process of systematic clearance. Every field, every dike, and every ruined village became a microcosm of the entire war, a desperate fight for inches that cost lives disproportionately. The sacrifices made by the Canadian forces in the Scheldt were strategically vital, but they came at a cost that marked the campaign as one of the most brutal of the entire Western Front. The loss of life ensured the survival of the Allied logistical line and the eventual triumph in Europe, a tragic equation where the individual courage of the soldier was traded for the collective survival of the strategic campaign. The mud of the Scheldt became hallowed ground, a permanent testament to the grim reality that some of the most important battles are the least glamorous, fought not for glory, but for the fundamental necessity of supply. The Battle of the Scheldt provided the Allied command with a harsh, undeniable lesson in the strategic power of terrain as a weapon. The campaign demonstrated how a determined, well-led defense could completely negate an overwhelming material and numerical advantage by expertly utilizing the unique features of the landscape. The flat, waterlogged lowlands of the Netherlands and Belgium were transformed from a geographical setting into an active, lethal participant in the conflict, dictating the terms of engagement and ensuring the battle was fought on German terms. The primary lesson was the effectiveness of engineered inundation. The deliberate flooding of the polders, the low-lying reclaimed farmlands, was a strategic stroke of genius that effectively canceled the Allied superiority in mechanized warfare. By making the land impassable to tanks and heavy vehicles, the German defense forced the engagement onto the narrow, elevated dikes. This not only restricted the movement of the Allied forces, but funneled them into predictable, linear attack routes, where they were exposed to concentrated, pre-sighted German fire. The vast advantage of the Allied Air Force was also minimized, as the flooded terrain provided minimal visual contrast, making it extremely difficult to identify and accurately target the concealed German positions. The subsequent lesson learned was the critical necessity of specialized amphibious warfare in the lowlands. The campaign required the Canadian forces to essentially fight as Marines, utilizing specialized landing craft and vehicles to cross the flooded terrain. The ultimate assault on Walcheren Island, which necessitated the bombing of the sea dikes to allow a controlled flood, confirmed that the only way to defeat the terrain was to first destroy it. This required a profound shift in operational planning, moving from standard infantry and armored doctrine to complex integrated assaults involving specialized engineers, Navy demolition teams, and commando units. The Scheldt proved that future operations in the lowlands could not rely solely on traditional military power, but required a detailed, expert understanding of hydraulic engineering and environmental destruction. Furthermore, the defense highlighted the importance of forward command post resilience. The Canadian command structure, constantly struggling to coordinate attacks across the fragmented watery landscape and facing immense logistical challenges, was forced to adapt rapidly. The low visibility, the difficulty of communication, and the constant threat of localized counterattacks demanded a decentralized, agile command structure that could support the isolated infantry units fighting on the dikes. The ultimate, long-term strategic lesson was the profound understanding of logistical vulnerability. The Scheldt campaign was a strategic victory precisely because it forced the Allied command to confront the limits of their supply chain. The agonizing month of fighting was the direct, high-cost solution to the supply crisis. The lessons learned in the lowlands, the need for massive port capacity, the necessity of specialized mine clearance, and the strategic importance of amphibious warfare were all integrated into the final planning for the push into Germany, ensuring that the Allies would never again allow their massive army to be starved by a single logistical choke point. The mud of the Scheldt yielded not only a crucial port, but also a series of invaluable, though costly, military lessons that streamlined the final phases of the European war. The final, lasting resonance of the Scheldt campaign echoes in the intimate contrast between the strategic triumph of the port of Antwerp and the individual sacrifice of Private William Davies. His last letter remains a profound, unerasable anchor, linking the sterile reality of logistical necessity to the raw, visceral cost of human life. The story of the Scheldt is, ultimately, the story of how the immense, collective effort of a modern army is entirely reliant upon the willingness of individual soldiers to endure the unendurable. Davies's final communication to his mother provides the critical human translation for the immense strategic goals. When historians speak of the 40,000 tons of cargo that Antwerp handled daily, they are speaking of the supplies that flowed, because Davies and his comrades were willing to crawl through the frozen mud and face the machine guns on the dikes. His death was the final price paid for the opening of the channel, a profound individual cost for a collective strategic benefit. The memory of his suffering, the constant cold, the water, the fear, is the necessary emotional counterpoint to the glorious historical narrative of the final victory. The sheer volume of individual sacrifice in the Scheldt, epitomized by Davies's farewell, highlights the immense pressure placed on the Canadian forces during this forgotten, brutal chapter of the war. They were fighting not only a highly professional enemy, but also the geographical circumstances created by a colossal logistical failure that preceded them. Their courage lay not in a quick, decisive battle, but in the sustained, agonizing process of attrition, a daily commitment to fight despite the odds and the overwhelming physical misery of the environment. The final legacy of the Scheldt campaign is a dual one. On the strategic level, it is a triumph of engineering and logistics, a necessary victory that guaranteed the end of the war in Europe. On the personal level, it is a haunting reminder of the moral and emotional debt owed to the men who fought there. The port of Antwerp, the key to the Allied victory, stands as a massive monument to the power of industry. The final letter of Private William Davies, preserved by the frozen ground, stands as an equally powerful, fragile monument to the singular human cost of that victory. His last words are the enduring voice of the logistical infantry, a plea for remembrance that ensures the strategic success is never divorced from the intimate, heartbreaking tragedy of the men who paid the final price in the mud and the mire of the lowlands. The sound of the ships docking in Antwerp is forever haunted by the silent echo of his final, unheard goodbye. The profound tactical and human cost of the Scheldt campaign exposed a critical strategic blind spot within the highest levels of the Allied command, a failure to fully appreciate the non-negotiable relationship between rapid advance and logistical security. The swift, euphoric dash across France in the summer of 1944, while militarily successful, bred a complacency regarding the critical need to secure essential supply arteries immediately. The strategic narrative had become fixated on the front lines and the encirclement of armies, overlooking the crucial, unglamorous necessity of the logistical tale. The primary error lay in the initial prioritization of objectives following the capture of Antwerp. While the British armored forces took the city, the subsequent crucial task of clearing the Scheldt estuary, a task that should have been launched simultaneously with the port's capture, was delayed. This delay, rooted in an overestimation of the German collapse and a misjudgment of the 15th Army's ability to reorganize, proved catastrophic. The time lost allowed the retreating German forces to consolidate their positions, mine the estuary extensively, and transform the entire waterway into a deeply entrenched defensive complex. The initial few days of delay translated directly into 5 weeks of agonizing, high-casualty fighting for the Canadian First Army. This failure of strategic foresight was a heavy scar on the reputation of the Allied leadership. The High Command had correctly identified Antwerp as the vital asset, but they had failed to recognize that the estuary was the true objective. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, later acknowledged that the failure to prioritize the clearing of the Scheldt immediately was one of the single greatest errors of the campaign. The High Command had become so focused on the rapid, ambitious plan for a decisive thrust into Germany, Montgomery's controversial Operation Market Garden, that they tragically sidelined the necessary, attritional, but essential work in the lowlands. The result was a profound moral and tactical dilemma for the frontline troops like Private William Davies. They were forced to pay the price for the strategic miscalculation with their lives and their endurance, fighting a war of necessity that was entirely avoidable in its subsequent brutality. The lack of proper logistical support reaching the forward troops, due to the protracted supply lines from Normandy, only compounded their misery. They were fighting for the very supply line that they themselves desperately needed, but could not yet access. The ultimate lesson etched into the Scheldt's muddy fields was that logistics is not merely a support function. It is the fundamental precondition for strategy. No offensive, no matter how ambitious or brilliant, can succeed if its supply chain is vulnerable or insufficient. The strategic blind spot cost the Allies not just time, but thousands of irreplaceable lives, and it exposed the inherent weakness of a command structure that allowed the euphoria of pursuit to eclipse the cold, hard logic of supply and demand. The mud and misery of the Scheldt served as a brutal final reminder that the war would not be won by ambition alone, but by the systematic, determined clearance of every logistical choke point. While the Scheldt campaign is most often remembered for the courage of the infantry, the actual clearance and operationalization of the port of Antwerp was a monumental victory belonging to the Allied engineers and technical specialists. Their efforts were a direct grinding war against the German capacity for defeatism. The systematic destruction and sabotage designed to deny the enemy the use of conquered resources. The success of the engineers in neutralizing this threat was as decisive as any infantry charge. The challenge was unprecedented. The German forces had executed a brilliant, thorough sabotage plan. They mined the Scheldt estuary with a complex array of mines, often laid in patterns designed to confuse and defeat standard minesweeping technology. The port's massive dock infrastructure, while structurally intact, was rendered unusable by demolition charges, sunken barges, and the immense volume of unexploded ordnance, UXO, scattered throughout the docks and warehouses. The German strategy was to delay the Allies by months, forcing them to continue relying on the tenuous supply line from Normandy. The Allied response was a technical masterpiece requiring immense courage. Clearance divers, often working in near-zero visibility in the murky, freezing water of the docks, manually disarmed or removed demolition charges attached to vital harbor installations. Royal Navy minesweeping flotillas pioneered new techniques to defeat the magnetic and acoustic mines, often utilizing highly dangerous experimental gear to clear the primary channel. The engineers, facing the additional task of repairing the massive sea dike breaches on Walcheren Island, worked under continuous threat from German long-range V-weapons targeting the port city. The effort was fueled by a profound sense of logistical imperative. Every engineer, diver, and dock worker understood that their work was the most important job on the Western Front. Their success would translate directly into less fighting and fewer casualties for the infantry. This awareness sustained the grueling, round-the-clock labor that was necessary to meet the demanding timeline set by the High Command. The engineering war was fought not in grand maneuvers, but in the painstaking, repetitive, high-risk work of dismantling German sabotage piece by piece. The eventual opening of the port, marked by the arrival of the first convoy, was not a sudden event but the calculated, methodical accumulation of small technical victories. The engineers' triumph was a demonstration of the Allied system's overwhelming capacity to dedicate specialized resources, manpower, technology, and sheer determination to solve any logistical problem the enemy could devise. They did not just repair the damage, they methodically dismantled the German strategy of denial. The clearance of Antwerp and the Scheldt estuary was the moment the Allies fully converted their industrial and technical supremacy into usable, decisive military power, a fitting counterpoint to the infantry's immense sacrifice in the mud. The engineers' quiet courage turned the key that finally unlocked the German defense. The V-weapon retaliation, Hitler's final fury, minimum 800 words. The moment the port of Antwerp became operational, the German High Command, fully realizing the fatal strategic consequence of the loss, launched a massive campaign of indiscriminate V-weapon retaliation against the city. This final act of fury, utilizing the long-range V-1 flying bombs and the devastating V-2 ballistic rockets, was not intended to achieve any military objective. It was a desperate symbolic act of terror and denial, aimed at breaking the port's capacity and the morale of the civilian population and the dock workers. Antwerp became the most heavily targeted city by V-weapons during the entire war. The German command recognized that destroying the logistical heart of the Allied forces was the last remaining option to slow the advance. The V-2 rockets, silent and arriving at supersonic speeds, offered no warning, inflicting immense psychological damage and random, catastrophic destruction. The V-1 flying bombs, with their characteristic pulsing jet engine sound, provided a terrifying countdown before their engine cut out and the bomb plummeted to Earth. The bombardment was continuous, turning the process of unloading vital supplies into an act of sustained, high-risk defiance. The Allied response to this terror campaign was multifaceted. Militarily, the Allies committed immense resources to Operation Crossbow, the continuous effort to locate and destroy the mobile V-2 launch sites and the V-1 launch ramps scattered across the occupied lowlands. Artillery and specialized anti-aircraft units were deployed in massive numbers around Antwerp, aiming to intercept the V-1s and V-2s, a task that proved technologically challenging but essential for civilian morale. The defense was high cost and only partially effective, but it significantly reduced the overall number of rockets reaching the target area. Crucially, the port of Antwerp never closed. The resilience of the Belgian civilian dock workers and the Allied logistical teams was absolute. Despite the constant barrage, the dock workers reported for duty daily, understanding that the port's operation was the single greatest contribution they could make to the war effort. Their defiance under fire was a final, profound moral victory against the terror tactics of the collapsing regime. The immense throughput of the port was rarely impacted for more than a few hours by any single V-weapon strike, a testament to the efficient damage control and the vast redundancy built into the massive port facility. The V-weapon campaign against Antwerp was a strategic failure. While it inflicted immense civilian casualties and caused significant localized destruction, it failed utterly in its strategic objective of stopping the flow of supplies. The port continued to operate at maximum capacity, pouring the necessary fuel and ammunition onto the European continent. Hitler's final fury was a desperate, futile gesture that merely confirmed the strategic importance of the prize that the Canadian, British, and Polish forces had paid so dearly to secure. The roar of the V-weapons was the sound of a desperate, defeated enemy striking out in blind rage, unable to alter the final mathematical certainty of the Allied logistical supremacy. The nature of the German defense in the Scheldt campaign, characterized by immense tactical professionalism, stood in stark moral contradiction to the collapsing ethical structure of the Nazi regime that it served. The soldiers of the 15th Army, particularly the paratroopers and Marine infantry, who made up the core of the Scheldt defense, fought with a fierce, disciplined commitment that earned grudging respect from their Allied adversaries. Yet, their commitment was expended in defense of a cause that was morally bankrupt and strategically doomed. The tactical actions of the German defenders were brilliant. The meticulous placement of mines, the thorough inundation of the land, and the relentless disciplined fire from fortified positions. These were the hallmarks of a highly trained, effective fighting force operating under the orders of competent field commanders. The German soldier was fighting for time, for survival, and often for the simple honor of his unit. The defense was a military success, maximizing Allied casualties and successfully delaying the use of Antwerp for over a month. However, this tactical excellence was deployed in service of a command that demonstrated profound, destructive contempt for its own soldiers and for the civilian population. The order to destroy the sea dikes on Walcheren Island, causing immense, long-term environmental and civilian harm, was an act of scorched earth desperation, prioritizing a military objective over any consideration for the population under its nominal protection. The subsequent V-weapon campaign against Antwerp, an indiscriminate bombardment aimed at the civilian population and infrastructure, confirmed the regime's final, total disregard for the laws of war and basic human decency. The moral burden on the German soldier was immense. They were fighting with immense personal risk, often enduring severe cold and supply shortages, only to be betrayed by the very system they served. Their sacrifice was strategically meaningless, consuming the last of the Wehrmacht's quality manpower and guaranteeing a swifter end for the regime, but only after inflicting massive, unnecessary suffering on both sides. The immense respect held by the Canadian infantry for the tactical skill of their German adversaries was constantly tempered by the grim understanding of the cause they were fighting for. The legacy of the German soldier in the Scheldt is thus complex and tragic, a professional, tactical excellence expended in service of a morally depraved and strategically delusional regime. Their final, disciplined resistance was a massive, bloody obstacle to the Allied advance, yet it ultimately served only to prolong the suffering and consume the last vestiges of the German military capacity. The immense human cost of the Scheldt, epitomized by the final, desperate resistance of the German forces, stands as a chilling reminder that tactical skill, when divorced from strategic reality and moral foundation, serves only to amplify the tragedy of defeat. The narrative of the Scheldt campaign is incomplete without recognizing the pivotal, often tragic role played by the civilian population, the unsung heroes whose resilience and suffering underscored the immense strategic importance of the battle. The inhabitants of the lowlands, Belgian dock workers, Dutch farmers, and the citizens of Antwerp were not passive bystanders. Their actions, their endurance, and their sheer will to survive were crucial factors in the Allied victory. The civilian population of Walcheren Island and the polders bore the initial destructive brunt of the fighting. The German policy of inundation and the subsequent Allied bombing of the sea dikes resulted in widespread destruction of homes, farmland, and infrastructure, displacing thousands and inflicting severe, long-term harm on the region. The necessity of using the sea as a weapon placed the local population in the direct line of fire, a grim casualty of the strategic objective. Yet the local resistance movements, often integrated into the Canadian and British command structures, provided invaluable intelligence, guiding Allied patrols, identifying German strongpoints, and facilitating the movement of supplies, directly contributing to the eventual success of the operations. The most critical civilian contribution came from the Antwerp dock workers. These workers, vital to the operation of the massive port, were immediately subjected to the indiscriminate terror of the German V-weapon campaign. They faced the daily, unpredictable threat of supersonic V-2 rockets and V-1 flying bombs, yet they reported for duty. Their resilience was extraordinary. They worked alongside Allied logistical crews, unloading cargo, operating the cranes, and maintaining the vast infrastructure, often returning to work hours after a V-weapon strike had decimated a nearby warehouse or street. Their refusal to be intimidated by the bombardment was a massive, sustained morale victory, ensuring that the port's throughput remained high despite Hitler's final fury. The dedication of the dock workers ensured the strategic payoff of the entire campaign. Had they succumbed to panic or refused to work under fire, the port would have become unusable, and the immense sacrifice of the Canadian forces would have been rendered meaningless. Their continued commitment under fire was a final, powerful demonstration that the morale and will of the civilian population, often ignored in military planning, is a critical component of the total war effort. They were, in effect, the logistical front line, enduring the high-risk work of unloading the ammunition and fuel that would defeat the enemy. The legacy of the civilians in the Scheldt is one of immense, quiet resilience and profound suffering. They endured the destruction of their homes, the trauma of the V bombardment, and the physical hardship of the war, yet they remained committed to the cause of liberation. Their story ensures that the Scheldt campaign is remembered not just as a military victory for the Allies, but as a testament to the endurance and ultimate moral triumph of the population caught in the crossfire of the strategic imperatives of modern warfare. The emotional and physical breakdown experienced by soldiers like Private William Davies was not the result of a single decisive shock, but rather the cumulative effect of polder fatigue, a specific form of combat exhaustion born from the unique, corrosive environment of the Scheldt lowlands. This specialized attrition targeted the fundamental operational capacity of the Canadian infantry, transforming a relentless military assault into an agonizing existential struggle against the elements. The analysis of polder fatigue is crucial to understanding the immense casualty rates and the emotional depth of Davies's final letter. The anatomy of polder fatigue begins with the constant, unyielding immersion. The freezing water and the persistent mud permeated every piece of clothing and equipment, ensuring that the soldiers were perpetually cold, wet, and physically uncomfortable. This led to high rates of non-battle injury, most notably immersion foot or trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and dampness that could render a soldier completely immobile, requiring lengthy hospitalization and permanent removal from the front. The necessity of evacuating these non-combat casualties placed an immense strain on the medical corps and the remaining fighting force, eroding the unit's cohesion inch by agonizing inch. Compounding the physical misery was the claustrophobia of the dike. The high ground on the dikes, while offering a clear line of fire, also exposed the infantry to relentless German observation and fire. The soldiers were forced to live and fight in the open, with minimal natural cover, enduring continuous shelling and mortar fire. Moving off the dike meant plunging into the freezing, mined water of the polders. This lack of maneuver space created a profound sense of entrapment, an inescapable vulnerability that maximized psychological stress. The fighting devolved into a series of predictable frontal assaults along linear pathways, a form of warfare that is psychologically the most taxing on the attacking force. The fatigue was further amplified by the slow operational tempo. Unlike the rapid advance through France, where the excitement of movement sustained morale, the Scheldt required slow, methodical clearance. Weeks were spent fighting for mere miles of ground, often leading to temporary setbacks and the necessity of retaking ground already purchased with immense sacrifice. This grinding, repetitive nature of the combat drained the soldiers' will, replacing high morale with a profound, weary resignation. The realization that the cost of every few feet of muddy dike was a guaranteed loss of life transformed the nature of the advance from triumph to unavoidable necessity. Private Davies's lament in his letter, the description of the cold burning and the inability to escape the water, is the classic symptom of polder fatigue. His final poignant desire for quiet and warmth back home was not merely a wish. It was a desperate physiological reaction to the extreme, continuous stress of a battle fought in an environment designed by the enemy to be fundamentally unsustainable for human endurance. The scars of the Scheldt were not only on the land but etched permanently into the minds and bodies of the men who survived the endless, waterlogged attrition. While the infantry fought their desperate, close-quarters battles in the flooded polders, a silent, equally critical conflict raged above and beyond the immediate front lines. The artillery duel, or the Battle of Counter-Battery. The dense concentration of German defensive positions in the Scheldt, particularly the heavy coastal batteries on Walcheren Island, required the Allied forces to commit overwhelming systematic artillery power to neutralize the threat and protect the vulnerable attacking infantry. This conflict became a technological and mathematical duel between the forward observation officers and the German fire control. The German artillery, especially the long-range batteries positioned on Walcheren, held a distinct and devastating advantage in the initial phases. They commanded the entire estuary and the surrounding land, firing from massive reinforced concrete casemates that were nearly impervious to all but the heaviest, most accurate bombing. These guns, firing massive 150mm and 203mm shells, were designed to sink ships, but were equally lethal against massed infantry and counter-battery positions. The German fire, accurate and relentless, was the primary cause of casualties among the Canadian and British support units, constantly disrupting supply lines and demoralizing the reserve forces. The Allied response was a colossal mobilization of firepower, utilizing every available medium and heavy field gun from the Canadian, British, and American Corps. The goal was simple: systematic counter-battery fire, CBE. This required highly specialized intelligence, forward observation posts enduring the heavy German fire, and aerial reconnaissance spotting the telltale flashes of the German guns. The intelligence was then fed through sophisticated fire control systems, allowing the Allied batteries to pinpoint and silence the German guns before they could inflict further damage. The precision and speed of the Allied fire were crucial, turning the duel into a rapid exchange of immense destruction. The sustained concentration of Allied artillery was not merely defensive, it was the essential precondition for the infantry assault. Before every attack across a dike or into a fortified village, the Allied artillery laid down a massive, continuous preparatory bombardment. This softening-up process was designed to destroy German defensive positions, cut communication lines, and, crucially, suppress the morale of the defenders. The sheer weight of Allied shells, a resource that the open port of Antwerp would soon make limitless, guaranteed that the infantry's final assault, though still costly, was significantly less suicidal than it would have been without this devastating curtain of fire. The climax of the artillery duel came during the assault on Walcheren, where the heavy batteries had to be neutralized to allow the final amphibious landing. The Allied artillery and air power focused a continuous, overwhelming barrage on the coastal casemates, firing thousands of rounds in a relentless effort to silence the German guns. This massive commitment of ordnance, a logistical feat in itself, ultimately succeeded, demonstrating that while the infantry paid the final price, the battle was won by the systematic, industrialized application of firepower that pulverized the enemy's defense before the men were ordered to advance. The most brutal tactical reality of the Scheldt campaign was the paradox of the dike, the expenditure of maximum effort for minimal territorial gain, a situation that crushed morale and accelerated the attrition rate. The German defense, meticulously planned around the elevated dikes and flooded terrain, forced the Canadian First Army into a continuous cycle of costly assaults where success was measured not in miles, but in meters of muddy, exposed earth. The paradox was rooted in the fixed nature of the battleground. The dikes were both the only safe-ish path for the infantry and the German army's most expertly targeted killing zone. Attacking across the width of a polder was impossible due to the inundation and the mines, meaning the assault had to proceed along the narrow spine of the dike. This geometry allowed the entrenched German machine gunners to focus their fire along a single, predictable line, minimizing the risk of misfire and maximizing the number of casualties with every sustained burst. The attack was effectively a forced funnel leading directly into the enemy's sights. The consequence was a grinding, agonizing operational reality. A single platoon might spend an entire night fighting desperately to advance 300 meters along a dike, only to be forced back 200 meters by a coordinated German counterattack at dawn. The high cost of taking the ground, the immense expenditure of artillery, smoke, and human life, was often disproportionate to the strategic value of the captured territory itself. The infantry was left with the soul-crushing realization that their immense sacrifice only yielded a brief, precarious toehold in the mud, a position that would need to be defended with equal ferocity against the inevitable counter-assault. This environment was a direct counter to the prevailing Allied doctrine of maneuver warfare. The Scheldt demanded a return to the grinding, attritional style of the First World War trenches, where progress was measured in feet, not miles, and every advance was immediately followed by a desperate need to dig in and consolidate. The psychological strain of this minimal gain for maximum cost permeated the ranks, feeding the deep sense of exhaustion described in Private Davies's final letter. The men were fighting not for a definitive victory, but for the agonizing incremental necessity of moving the supply line one step closer to Antwerp. The paradox was finally resolved not by superior infantry tactics, but by the application of overwhelming engineering and firepower, the massive preparatory bombardments, and the use of amphibious vehicles that could bypass the dikes entirely. But until that point, the men of the Scheldt were locked into a brutal, unforgiving reality, where their courage and sacrifice were systematically neutralized by the unforgiving geography and the tactical brilliance of the German defense. The immense effort required to break the paradox of the dike stands as the primary tactical lesson of the campaign, that the hardest battles are often the ones where the enemy has successfully forced the fight onto a single, predictable, and lethal path. Amidst the devastating tactical realities and the immense human cost of the Scheldt campaign, the final narrative is one of profound moral triumph. The unwavering resilience and determination of the Canadian First Army and their Allied comrades to persevere against overwhelming environmental, psychological, and tactical odds. This moral fortitude was the ultimate weapon that ensured the campaign's success, a testament to the soldiers' unbreakable will. The moral triumph was rooted in the soldiers' clear understanding of the strategic necessity. Unlike other battles fought for territorial gain, the men in the Scheldt knew they were fighting for the very lifeblood of the entire Allied war effort. They were the logistical infantry, and their success meant the end of the supply crisis and the guarantee of victory in Europe. This clarity of purpose, though grim, provided the essential moral fuel to continue the brutal, agonizing advance through the mud and the mire. The sacrifice was accepted because the outcome was non-negotiable. The resilience was evident in the esprit de corps that characterized the Canadian units. Facing the common enemy of the environment and the relentless German fire, the small units and platoons developed an intense, self-sustaining bond. They relied on their comrades for survival against the high risk of drowning, hypothermia, and enemy action. The collective effort to evacuate the wounded, to secure the next tenuous foothold, and to endure the continuous immersion was an act of profound mutual dependence that sustained morale even when the body was exhausted. The soldier's commitment was not to an abstract ideal, but to the tangible, immediate reality of the man fighting beside him. The moral victory extended to the technical teams. The engineers, the minesweepers, and the clearance divers, working under immense pressure and constant threat from V-weapons and delayed-action mines, sustained their high-risk operations with unwavering discipline. Their collective, tireless effort to neutralize the German strategy of denial was a direct reflection of the belief in the mission's ultimate importance. Their success in opening the port of Antwerp was a moral and technical triumph that signaled to the German command that the Allied will could not be broken by destruction, terror, or logistical obstruction. The final surrender of the German forces in the Scheldt was a direct consequence of this sustained moral pressure. The German tactical brilliance was ultimately defeated not by a lack of skill, but by the relentless, unwavering nature of the Allied attack. The Canadian soldier, exhausted, cold, and depleted, simply refused to stop advancing inch by agonizing inch until the entire estuary was secured. This unyielding perseverance, born from a profound understanding of the mission's gravity, was the true moral triumph of the Scheldt campaign, a final, poignant affirmation of the human capacity for endurance in the face of absolute strategic necessity. The enduring legacy of the Scheldt campaign is permanently anchored in the sacrifice of the logistical infantry, the men who fought the least glamorous, yet most strategically essential battle of the late war. The final image of the campaign is not the triumphant entry of tanks into a liberated city, but the haunting echo of Private William Davies's unspoken goodbye, a memory frozen in the waterlogged soil of the lowlands. The Scheldt became the grim proof that the war was not won by brilliant single-stroke offensives, but by the systematic, determined clearance of every logistical obstacle. Davies's final unread letter serves as the ultimate historical document of the soldier's burden. It is a demand that we view the final victory not through the lens of strategic maps and high-command communiques, but through the intimate reality of the cold, the hunger, and the fear that consumed the individual life. His sacrifice, multiplied by thousands of Canadian, British, and Polish casualties, was the price paid to keep the logistical heart of the Allied war machine beating. The opening of the port of Antwerp was his final, immense legacy. The strategic importance of the campaign fundamentally redefined modern military thought regarding the primacy of logistics. The Scheldt proved that the speed of an army is dictated not by the fastest tank, but by the efficiency of the slowest point in its supply chain. The sheer technical effort required to clear the estuary, the minesweeping, the dike repairs, and the anti-V weapon defense became the template for post-war military planning, cementing the principle that logistical resilience must be guaranteed before any major offensive is launched. The battle was a final, painful lesson that the true measure of military power is the capacity to sustain the fight indefinitely. The tragedy of the Scheldt lies in its historical anonymity, overshadowed by the initial drama of the Normandy breakout and the later intensity of the Battle of the Bulge. The protracted, muddy struggle for the estuary often fades into the background. Yet without the victory won in the Scheldt, the Allied armies would have been starved of fuel and ammunition, leaving them highly vulnerable to the German counteroffensive. The men who fought there secured the victory in Europe, but they did so in a theater that offered little of the glory of more famous battlefields. The legacy, therefore, is one of unspoken necessity. The silent work of the engineers, the resilience of the dock workers, and the immense, costly perseverance of the infantry guaranteed the end of the war. Private William Davies's final, heartbreaking farewell is the enduring voice of that necessary sacrifice, a profound human footnote to the strategic triumph of the logistical age. His goodbye is the final, powerful reminder that behind every massive military victory lies the quiet, singular tragedy of a soldier who never came home, a sacrifice forever etched into the cold, wet soil of the lowlands.